It is 2 in the morning, and a bell is ringing. Not a grand bell, not the kind that announces a king or warns of fire. A single, steady tone, iron striking iron, echoing down a stone corridor where no light enters. This is the sound that begins every day inside a medieval Benedictine monastery. Not sunrise, not a rooster, a bell, rung by a man who was appointed to ring it at an hour when the rest of Europe is asleep. The monk who rings the bell is called the circuiter. He wakes before everyone else, which means he wakes in the deepest darkness, walks the dormitory with a lantern, and strikes the bell a fixed number of times. If a monk does not rise, the circuiter is permitted to hold the lantern close to his face. That is the only warning. At Cluny, the rule was harsher. If a monk was found asleep 3 times, the drowsy man was forced to take over the circuiter's own duty, walking the dormitory for the rest of the night, lantern in hand, denied the sleep he wanted so badly. The monks rise from wooden beds. They are not beds in any modern sense. A straw mattress on a plank, a single wool blanket, sometimes a pillow stuffed with hay. They sleep in their robes. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and still governing their lives 700 years later, specifies that monks must be ready to rise without delay. There is no washing, no conversation, no stretching or yawning allowed. In some abbeys, such as Cluny in Burgundy, the dormitory held over 90 monks sleeping in a single open hall, shoulder to shoulder, with 97 glazed windows that let in just enough moonlight to see the floor. A candle burned through the night at each end of the hall, not for comfort, but so that darkness itself would not become an excuse for misbehavior. The night stair, a narrow stone passage built directly from the dormitory into the church, allowed them to descend in darkness without ever stepping outside. At Furness Abbey in northern England, this staircase still survives, worn stone steps hollowed by 250 years of bare feet shuffling down in the dark. If you press your hand into the grooves, you can feel the centuries. They file into the church for matins, the first of 8 prayer services that divide the day. The church is unheated. In winter, the church is so cold that the holy water in the font sometimes freezes. The breath of 40 men hangs visible in the air. They do not sit, they stand in wooden choir stalls, facing each other across the nave, and they sing. The singing is not entertainment. It is work, the primary work of a monk's life. The psalms are chanted in Latin, in a slow, monophonic line that rises and falls like breathing. There is no harmony, no accompaniment, no variation in volume, just one unbroken line of human voice filling cold stone. Matins lasts roughly 45 minutes. In the dead of winter, the monks can see nothing beyond the candlelight. The walls, the ceiling, the faces beside them all dissolve into darkness. Only the voices remain. When it ends, they return to the dormitory and sleep again, briefly. At approximately 6 o'clock, another bell rings for lauds, the dawn office, then prime at around 7. The day has barely started, and they have already prayed 3 times. The rule of Saint Benedict devoted more chapters to prayer than to any other subject. It did not matter if the bread was half-baked, or the roof leaked, or the abbot was ill. When the bell rang, you went. Over the course of a single day, a monk might spend 5 to 6 hours in the church. At Cluny, that number was closer to 8. And a monk there recited roughly 215 psalms before the day was over. Over a lifetime, he would sing the entire book of Psalms, all 150, every single week. Prayer came first. Everything else arranged itself around it. After prime, the monks walk in silence through the cloister, the covered stone walkway that forms a square at the heart of every monastery. The cloister connects everything: the church to the north, the dormitory to the east, the refectory to the south, the storerooms to the west. In the center, an open courtyard, sometimes a fountain, sometimes just grass and sky. A monk could live his entire life within this square and never feel the need to leave. The cloister was not merely a corridor. On fine days, monks sat along stone benches set into the walls, reading or meditating. In some abbeys, one side of the cloister was designated the carol walk, fitted with small wooden partitions where monks could study in semi-privacy, their books chained to the desk to prevent loss. The chain was not a symbol of distrust. Books were simply too valuable to risk. A single psalter was worth more than a year's wages for a skilled laborer. It was the closest thing a monk had to a room of his own. Before entering the chapter house, each monk washes his hands and face at the lavabo, a stone basin fed by lead pipes, sometimes carved with lions or foliage. It is one of the few moments of physical comfort in the day. The chapter house is where the community meets each morning. The abbot sits in a raised chair. The monks sit on stone benches along the walls. A passage from the Rule of St. Benedict is read aloud, one chapter per day, cycling endlessly through the year. The same passages return again and again over the years. A monk who has lived long enough in the abbey could recite the entire rule from memory, and many did. Then the abbot assigns the day's tasks. Who will work in the garden? Who will copy manuscripts? Who will tend the sick? Who will bake bread? But the chapter house was not always so orderly. At the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds in the late 12th century, the morning chapter regularly descended into politics. Monks accused one another of embezzlement. The sacrist, a man named William, secretly borrowed 40 marks from a Jewish moneylender to repair the treasury and never paid it back. The debt tripled. When royal letters arrived demanding repayment, the abbot was so furious he nearly fired William on the spot. He didn't. The debt grew. The monastery borrowed more to cover what William owed. The chronicler Jocelyn of Brakeland, who recorded all of this, watched it unfold with the helpless fascination of a man who understood exactly what was happening and could do nothing to stop it. Punishments were also delivered in the chapter house. A monk who spoke during the Great Silence, or who arrived late to prayer, confessed his fault and received a penance. Extra prayers, reduced meals, sometimes physical discipline. For more serious offenses, theft, violence, persistent disobedience, a monk could be expelled from the community entirely, cast out into a world he had long since abandoned. The system is not cruel by design, it is absolute. The monastery functions only because every man inside it agrees to the same structure, the same rhythm, the same surrender of personal will. There are no personal belongings. The rule is explicit. A monk owns nothing. Not his clothes, not his books, not the pen he writes with. Everything belongs to the community. Even the hours of his day are not his own. At Bury St. Edmunds, Abbot Samson once confiscated 33 personal seals from monks who had been using them to take on private debts. He collected every key to every chest, cupboard, and box in the monastery. If you owned something, you were hiding it, and sooner or later, the abbot would find it. After the chapter meeting, the monastery becomes a small, silent city. A large medieval abbey was entirely self-sufficient. It grew its own grain, milled its own flour, baked its own bread, brewed its own ale, raised its own fish in purpose-built ponds, kept bees for honey and wax, and maintained orchards, vineyards, vegetable gardens, and herb plots, all within or adjacent to the enclosure walls. The ideal monastery site, as the 12th century chronicler Orderic Vitalis noted, was close to both water and woodland, water for drinking, cooking, washing, sanitation, and powering mills, woodland for fuel, timber, and the pannage of pigs. Some monasteries produced 300 gallons of ale per week, enough to supply not only the monks, but also the laborers, the guests, and the poor who came to the gate for charity. In famine years, the line at the gate stretched longer than the abbey wall itself. The brewery was among the most important buildings. Monks drank ale because the water was often unsafe. Each monk received a daily ration, roughly a gallon. The ale was weak by modern standards, but constant. In 1289, records from a Benedictine house note a batch that came out unusually strong. The entry does not say what happened next. One suspects it was memorable. The bakehouse stood close to the brewery, sharing its heat. A large abbey could consume hundreds of loaves a day. The bread was dark, dense, made from coarse ground flour that would break a modern tooth. White bread existed, but it was reserved for the abbot's table and distinguished guests. The ordinary monk ate what the ordinary peasant ate, only with more regularity and less risk of starvation. The infirmary stood apart from the main cloister, usually to the east, with its own garden of medicinal herbs: sage for sore throats, rue for headaches, fennel for digestion, hyssop for chest complaints, lavender for sleeplessness. The infirmary was the closest thing medieval Europe had to a hospital, and monks were often the closest thing it had to doctors. Sick monks were granted privileges forbidden to the healthy: meat, a fire, permission to rest during prayer hours. Some monks, the chronicles quietly suggest, fell ill more often than strictly necessary. The herb garden was not decorative, it was a pharmacy. English heritage records show that a typical monastic garden included over 40 species of medicinal plants, each with a specific application passed down through handwritten herbals copied in the scriptorium. The garden was tended with the same reverence as the library, because in a world without physicians, plants were the only medicine, and knowledge of them was the difference between life and death. Manual labor occupies the hours between prayer services: terce at mid-morning, sext at noon. At Cluny, the work began with a procession to the fields, where the prior opened with a Kyrie eleison and an Our Father. While they plowed, they recited psalms for the dead. Even in the dirt, the rhythm of prayer did not stop. The hands that hold a psalter at dawn hold a hoe by 10 o'clock. The rule considers this not a contradiction, but a unity. Labor is prayer made physical. In a room with tall windows facing north to catch even, shadow-free light, a row of monks sit at angled wooden desks. Each has a quill, a knife for sharpening it, a pot of ink made from oak galls and iron salts, and a sheet of prepared animal skin, vellum, scraped thin enough to see light through. This is the scriptorium, and the work done here is among the most consequential in European history. A single book could take a year to produce. The scribe first ruled faint lines with a stylus, then copied the text letter by letter from an exemplar, an original that might itself be centuries old. A Bible required roughly 300 sheets of vellum, the skins of over 150 calves. Mistakes were scraped away with a blade and written over. The margin for error was essentially zero. The work was physically brutal. Monks wrote for 6 to 8 hours a day, hunched over desks in unheated rooms. Their fingers cramped, their backs ached, their eyes strained in candlelight during the short winter days. In winter, ink froze in the pot, and the scribe had to breathe on it or hold it near a candle before each stroke. One medieval English scribe left a prayer in the margin of his manuscript: "God help minim handum, God help my hands." They were not alone in their suffering. Complaints survive scattered across centuries of finished manuscripts. "Oh, my hand, the parchment is hairy. Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink." One colophon, found in a 13th century manuscript at Leiden University, reads, "Hoc opus est scriptum magister da mihi potum." This work is written. Master, give me a drink. Another reads, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides." These are not jokes. They are the honest protests of men engaged in relentless, painstaking labor. But between the complaints, the monks also doodled. Rabbits jousting with lances, snails attacking knights, a fox dressed as a bishop preaching to geese, a donkey playing a harp, a knight in full armor battling a giant snail, a motif so common across European manuscripts that scholars still debate what it means. These marginal illustrations, found in manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries, reveal something the rule of Saint Benedict tried to suppress: personality, humor, boredom made visible. And then there were the stranger entries. Caesarius of Heisterbach, a 12th century Cistercian, recorded the story of a wandering clerk who entered a monastery as a novice, not out of devotion, but because he wanted to steal the gold chalices. He waited an entire year, could not get access to the treasury, and decided to take full vows just so he could reach the altar during Mass. The moment he put on his monk's habit, he claims, he was struck by a sudden and genuine conversion. He stayed, he became prior, and he told this story to every new novice for the rest of his life. The finished manuscripts were works of art. Illuminated initials, the large decorated letters at the start of each chapter, could take days to complete. Gold leaf was applied, burnished until it caught the light. Pigments made from lapis lazuli, crushed insects, and ground minerals gave the pages their extraordinary blues, reds, and greens. A completed illuminated Bible was worth as much as a house. Some were worth more. And it was through this process, slow, painful, one letter at a time, that the texts of antiquity survived. The works of Plato and Seneca survived not because the Roman Empire preserved them, but because monks in cold rooms in England, Ireland, France, and Germany copied them before the originals crumbled. Without the monasteries, the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world would have vanished as completely as the buildings that housed it. Every page a monk finished was, in a very real sense, a rescue mission, pulling a voice out of oblivion, one letter at a time. At noon, the bell rings for sext. After the short service, the monks proceed to the refectory, the communal dining hall. This is the main meal of the day, and in many monasteries, the only full meal. The refectory is a long, high-ceilinged room with rows of wooden tables and benches. Before entering, each monk washes his hands at the lavabo. The Cluniacs were especially zealous about personal hygiene, a small point of pride in a world where bathing was rare and fleas were a fact of life. The food is simple. Bread, each monk receives roughly 1 pound per day. Pottage, beans, cheese, eggs, fish on permitted days. The rule of Saint Benedict forbids the meat of 4-legged animals for healthy monks. Fish was acceptable because medieval theology did not classify it as meat. Wine was served every day at Cluny. In English houses, it was ale. On feast days, Christmas, Easter, the patron saint's day, the diet improved dramatically. Records from Durham Priory show that the Christmas meal could include salmon, pike, roasted fowl, spiced wine, and honeyed pastries. But on ordinary days, the table was plain and the portions measured. Waste is a sin. Whatever bread remains is collected and given to the poor at the abbey gate. The monastery fed not only itself, but the community around it. No one speaks during the meal. A single monk stands at a raised lectern and reads aloud Scripture, the lives of the saints, passages from the Church Fathers. The only sounds are his voice and the scrape of spoons. This was not a rule that was loosely observed. The silence at meals was enforced with penalties. Monks developed an elaborate system of hand signals to communicate basic needs. A flapping motion meant fish. A pulling gesture at the ear meant milk because of a goat's ear. Hands cupped together meant soup. A circular motion over the back of the hand meant bread. Over 60 distinct signs have been documented. A full conversation could be conducted without a single word. Not everyone accepted this gracefully. The Bishop of Ely, visiting monasteries on papal authority, discovered that a number of monks had been requesting permission to go on pilgrimages to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, to the tomb of St. Edmund, and then simply not going. They were running around having fun instead. The chronicler does not specify what kind of fun. One imagines the silence of the refectory may have had something to do with it. After the meal, the monks returned to manual labor until noon, the mid-afternoon prayer. The rhythm is unchanging. Prayer, work, prayer, work, prayer. The hours blur, the days blur. The seasons are marked not by holidays or events, but by the liturgical calendar. Advent, Lent, Eastertide, Ordinary Time, each with its own set of readings, its own hymns, its own dietary rules. The afternoon is also the time when monks might visit the calefactory, the warming room. In a monastery where the church, the dormitory, the cloister, and the refectory are all unheated, this single room contains the only fire. At Revold's Abbey in Yorkshire, the warming house evolved over centuries from a small ground floor chamber to a 2-story building, a sign of how desperately it was needed. The monks would sit here briefly, warming their hands, drying their clothes, thawing their ink, before returning to the scriptorium. The records from Durham note that a fire was kept burning in the common house from November to Easter, and that senior monks were sometimes permitted separate fires. It was a small mercy in a life designed around the deliberate refusal of comfort. The silence was not a rule among other rules. It was the room in which everything else took place. A monk who learned the 60 hand signs, who sat through 1,000 wordless meals, who warmed his hands at the single permitted fire, and then returned without comment to his desk. That monk did not experience silence as absence. He experienced it as a medium, the way a fish experiences water. The refectory was silent. The cloister was silent. The calefactory, where men sat close enough to touch, was silent. And over the years, the silence stopped being something imposed and became something inhabited, a space with its own textures, its own weight, its own kind of company. Some monks lived 30, 40, 50 years inside these walls and never once raised their voice. But if you had asked one of them whether his life was quiet, he might not have understood the question. The silence was full. It was full of listening. The last service of the day is Compline. It begins after sunset, in winter as early as 6 o'clock, in summer as late as 9. The monks gather in the church one final time. The candles are fewer now. The light is low. At Cluny, the major mass earlier in the day was lit by almost 500 candles. Now at Compline, there are perhaps a dozen. The contrast is deliberate. The day ends quietly. Compline is the shortest and most intimate of the 8 offices. The psalms are quieter. The hymn, Te lucis ante terminum, before the ending of the light, is among the most beautiful in the entire liturgical tradition. It is a prayer for protection through the night, against darkness both literal and spiritual. The melody is simple, ancient, and almost unbearably gentle. It sounds less like singing and more like the building itself breathing. When Compline ends, the great silence begins. From this moment until after prime the following morning, no monk may speak for any reason except genuine emergency. The abbot sprinkles holy water on each monk as he leaves the church. A final blessing, a small cold shock on the forehead, and then nothing. They file out of the church, climb the night stair, and return to their beds. The dormitory is dark. The only sound is breathing. A lamp burns at each end of the hall, all night, every night, not for warmth, not for reading, but as a symbol. The faithful Catholic is never found without his lamp lit, even in sleep. And yet, not every monk made it to this moment in peace. Some hated the life. The chronicler Jocelyn of Brakeland records that Abbot Samson of Bury St. Edmunds, one of the most capable administrators in English monastic history, repeatedly told anyone who would listen that he wished he had never become a monk. When that failed to express his frustration, he said he wished he had never been made abbot. What he really wanted, Jocelyn writes, was to be the librarian. But the monastery does not ask what you want, it tells you what you are. Some monks ran away. The book Runaway Religious in Medieval England documents hundreds of cases between 1240 and 1540. Some vanished into cities and were never found. Medieval authorities had neither the infrastructure nor the motivation to track them. Some returned voluntarily, did their penance, and were quietly reabsorbed. Some were caught trying to reclaim noble titles they had surrendered. The monastery, for all its silence, was not immune to the most basic human impulse, the desire to be somewhere else. But most stayed, and this was the shape of their life. Not a day, a life. A monk who entered the abbey at 18 and died at 70 would have lived roughly 19,000 days inside these walls, and every single one of them followed the same pattern, the same bells, the same psalms, the same bread, the same silence, the same stones underfoot. The monastery did not offer variety, stimulation, choice, or novelty. It offered the opposite. The restless human appetite for novelty and stimulation was deliberately, carefully, lovingly refused. Some abbeys stood for 500 years. The men inside them changed. The routine did not. A monk who entered the abbey as a young man and died as an old one would have heard the same hymn at Compline perhaps 15,000 times, and on the last night it would have sounded no less beautiful than on the first. And perhaps that was the point. Not to see new things, but to see the same things as if for the first time. To find in repetition not boredom, but depth. To believe that one stone corridor, one wooden choir stall, one iron bell ringing at 2 in the morning contained, if you listened closely enough, everything. The bell rings. The day begins again.